Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first panel today. This is the panel on FERC Order 1920 and electric transmission in New York. A couple housekeeping items before we get started. This panel is going to be structured as a discussion. We have an amazing set of panelists today, and we will save time at the end for questions. So if things come up, please keep them stored. We will have plenty of time at the end for a little Q&A. Also, another just general disclaimer, the views expressed here on this panel are by the panelists as individuals. They're not on behalf of their clients or organizations unless they want to say so otherwise. But we want to get that out of the way so we can get to the meat of everything. And now I will get to the introductions. I'm Angela Sicker. I'm going to be the moderator for the panel today. I'm currently an attorney at the New York Independent System Operator, or the NYISO. At the NYISO, I advise my teams on interconnection and planning related matters. Prior to that, I was in private practice at a law firm called Barkley Damon, an upstate New York law firm. And there I worked on developing renewable energy projects, transmission projects, the financing, the permitting, anything touching project development for renewable energy and transmission projects. And then prior to that, I was at Vermont Law School. That's where I received my JD and was a very proud mentee of Kevin B. Jones. So I'm very honored to be here today. I wouldn't have gone to Vermont if I hadn't met Kevin, and I wouldn't be sitting here today speaking to all of you. So just a little thank you in honor of him. Now the fun part, the rest of the panelists. Right next to me, I have Brian HODGDON. Brian HODGDON is a senior attorney at the New York Independent System Operator, my colleague. Brian serves as in-house counsel to the NYISO, where he supports the NYISO's work and planning for the transmission system in New York State. Brian began working at the NYISO in 2016 and has focused on transmission and resource planning and interconnection matters. He also serves as the director for the Northeast chapter of the Energy Bar Association. And prior to joining the NYISO, Brian served as a judge advocate in the United States Navy, an attorney in private practice, and an appellate attorney for the New York State Supreme Court Appellate Division, 3rd Judicial Department. Long titles. Brian received his Juris Doctorate degree from Albany Law School and holds a Bachelor of Arts in Economics from the College of the Holy Cross. And then we also have Dana Lazarus. Dana Lazarus is the director of the Energy Markets Policy Group at ConEdison. Dana and her team are responsible for developing the company's positions on federal energy policy issues and advocating for those positions at FERC, NYISO, PJM, and the New York Public Service Commission. Prior to joining ConEdison, Dana had significant experience working in wholesale electricity markets, electric transmission, and federal energy regulatory policy from her time at the Electric Reliability Council of Texas and S&P Global Platts and Analytics. And at S&P Global Platts Analytics. Dana has a Bachelor of Science in Environmental Engineering from Harvard University and a Master of Public Affairs from the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. And then we also have Matt LIFSON. Matt LIFSON is an attorney at the Institute for Policy Integrity at NYU School of Law. He primarily works on electricity policy with a focus on transmission lines, electricity markets, hydrogen, and environmental justice. He is admitted to practice in New York. Matt earned his JD from Yale Law School and a master's in environmental management from the Yale School of the Environment. Before joining Policy Integrity, he clerked for Chief Judge John D. Levy of the U.S. District Court for the District of Maine and Associate Justice William H. Hood III of the Colorado Supreme Court. And last but not least, we have Abe Silverman. Abe is a researcher at Ralph O'Connor Sustainable Energy Institute and a principal of Silver Green Consulting. Abe focuses on bringing academics, business leaders, and state and federal regulators together to solve the most pressing barriers to the clean energy transition. Before coming to Hopkins, Abe served as the managing director of the non-technical barriers to the clean energy transition at Columbia University's Center on Global Energy Policy. And prior to his work at Columbia University, he was general counsel and executive policy counsel for the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, working on PJM market issues and policy. Prior to going to the state service, Abe was an executive at NRG Energy, Inc. It's always a tongue twister, one of the largest owners of power plants in the country. So with that, now we can dive in to our wonderful conversation. To get started, I know not everyone is flipping through the 1,000-page orders that FERC puts out now annually, it seems like. But I think it would be helpful if we start giving a little background on transmission in New York. So the best place to start is with the law and FERC orders. So Brian, do you think you could give us an overview of some of the FERC orders that got us here?
Sure. I think it's too close. I think we'd be remiss if we didn't start at 888, right? 888 was the creation of really the ISOs, RTOs, the pro forma by the commission, and really the introduction of competition through open access. But 888 really didn't provide that avenue for a requirement that RTOs, ISOs, and other transmission providers actually do a regional transmission planning process for transmission. So then after several years, I think it was 2007, I actually left the notes for this one at home. So if I get any dates off, please forgive me. But, we get Order 890 that comes out. And 890 really started to require the transmission planning for regions. And you got the 9 principles from Order 890, which really looked to create transmission planning on a regional basis that provided transparency, openness, coordination. And this is really a test made, but information sharing, and started to get into cost allocation for mainly reliability, and also required economic planning, because prior to 890, many of the regions were already engaging in some level of reliability planning. But 890 started to open that door and bring forth economic planning as well. So you started to see transitions to the oaths in the way that regions started to create their planning processes to have this transparency, have this openness, have this coordination with stakeholders, because prior to that, it was largely either the ISO RTOs and the individual TOs that were doing the majority of the planning, and largely focused on less regionally, but more locally. And then we get to the big order that starts to open the door, right, which was Order 1000. And Order 1000, I think if you're involved in transmission planning, everyone hears Order 1000, they immediately think competition, right? But Order 1000 really did more than just create more competition on the system. It had reforms to the planning process to not only look at reliability and economic, but the precursor to what's going on in 1920 is what? It started requiring transmission providers to look at transmission needs driven by public policy requirements. And that's where you started to see the changes where now they weren't required to build or to actually move forward, but they're required to plan for it. And then you also saw other changes there, where changes in cost allocation, where they still relied on the 890 principles for cost allocation, but then further expanded it. And then you get into where I think the most contentious stuff was the non-incumbent reforms, where it was, again, coming to opening competition, because FERC saw that in competition, FERC believes that it results in just and reasonable rates. So you had the non-incumbent developer reforms, which required the elimination of rights of first refusals from commission tariff and agreements that basically reserved to the TOs the right to build on and recover the cost for their transmission facilities, with certain exceptions. So Order 1000, I think everyone knows that was subject to many, many contests, and it took years for several ISO regions to develop and implement their compliance plans approved by FERC. But those were really the buildups to, I think, what we're going to be talking about in 1920. Is these are the FERC orders, and obviously there's a lot more detail. And I don't think I want to bore everyone here with all the excruciating detail. But when you look at it, each step along the way FERC was slowly requiring greater planning at the regional level, as well as local planning too. And I actually was remiss, in 890 was really the introduction also of a requirement for local transmission planning too, with the same coordination, openness, and transparency that was required at the regional level as well. So that's really the landscape we're working with. I don't know, Matt, if anyone else has things that they want to add. I obviously went in a high level, but that really is the groundwork upon which 1920 is building off of, and what ISOs, RTOs, and transmission providers are going to have to work with.
I mean, that was very comprehensive, but I'll add a little bit, just in case like not everybody lives in FERC land all the time. So
Which I do.
These look like Furklanders. No.
just rewinding a little bit, FERC implements the Federal Power Act, among other statutes, and Section 206 of the Federal Power Act says that whenever FERC finds that there's some kind of practice that's affecting electricity rates that is unjust, unreasonable, discriminatory, unduly preferential, it can step in and replace the practice with something that it selects instead that would be just and reasonable. And so Order 890 was a little bit more focused on sort of like this, the preferences and the discrimination. Basically, FERC stepped in and said, we just told transmission providers that they need to treat other transmission customers the same way that they would treat their own generation resources. But it's too hard for us right now, or we don't think that the planning is necessarily happening the same way. We think that the planning processes are too opaque, and therefore we're going to open up the planning processes, crack open the black box, say like you have to engage with your transmission customers, invite them to the table, share your data inputs, create sort of like a stakeholder process. And through that set of reforms, we'll be more confident that you're planning for everybody's transmission needs equally and not just your own transmission needs. And then I would say Order 1000 focused a little bit more on the unjust and unreasonable rates. That was when FERC said, I mean, they both focused on both, but FERC said, we don't really think that these regional plans that exist thus far are appropriately looking at regionalized solutions. Too many of the regional plans are just taking the local plans and smushing everything together and just making sure that there aren't any like reliability problems when you run all the local plans together. We need to start looking at solutions that will achieve economies of scale and build certain larger lines that will prevent us from needing to build lots of smaller lines. And if we do that, the whole thing will be cheaper. So just and reasonable rates.
Great. And also too, just, I know there's a lot of buzzwords and stuff in alphabet soup when we are in FERC land, but it might be helpful too. Could someone describe the differences between what a regional plan or a local plan is? So when we say local, who are we talking about?
I would say that would be Edison. So when we say regional versus local, Brian kind of hinted at it. Before we had ISOs and RTOs, we had, the electric system was basically operated by individual transmission owners, each responsible for our service territory. And we had agreements with our neighbors and worked together, but there was no entity that was really responsible for comprehensively planning across the whole system. And so when FERC issued Order 888 and its subsequent orders, we organized into various ISOs and RTOs across the country. So ISO, Independent System Operator, RTO, Regional Transmission Organization. In essence, kind of the same thing. The legal nuances are above my head, but essentially it's an independent organization that doesn't actually own any of the wires or the generation, but they're the entity that's responsible for kind of operating the grid. When I worked at ERCOT, we always like to say that we were like the air control towers. We were kind of telling all the electrons where to go across the system. And so once we set up the ISOs and RTOs, the way that the division of labor really works is that the ISO or RTO, they plan for the entire region. So here in New York, that means planning for all of New York State across the different transmission owners we have here. In PJM, it's planning across multiple states who are part of the region. And that's what we refer to as regional. So regional is kind of the ISO or RTO region, whether it's a single state ISO or a multi-state ISO. And then when we talk about local, that's referring to kind of the work that transmission owners do planning for our own service territories. So, and then just to add another wrinkle, then when we talk about interregional, that's between the regions. So like that's between NYISO and PJM, for example. So hopefully that helps to kind of clarify some of that.
Definitely. Yes. No, thank you, everyone. I think that's a great sort of summary. We've talked about how obviously this all stems from the Federal Power Act and FERC's interpretations of that, and how its big landmark orders have directed our ISOs and RTOs to plan the grid. So, but how then does the transmission actually get built, especially in New York? What are the different processes that have allowed for transmission to get built?
I mean, I'm happy to start. Please, Danny, jump in as well. I think it's best to say, how did it all come to be? And, New York, and NYISO and the New York TOs were, in some ways, I wasn't there when it all happened. So this is all based on my knowledge of filings and things like that. But we were really at the cutting edge of it, where even before 890, the NYISO and the New York TOs created a comprehensive reliability planning process at a regional level, where they already started coordinating before there. And then 890, it was reformed 1000. So what's that left with is really the NYISO has what we call the comprehensive system planning process. And that encompasses the local transmission planning process that ConEdison and the other TOs in the state are responsible for planning at the local level and for local needs, as well as public policy requirements, right? And then you have the reliability planning process, where we look at the reliability, any violations of reliability criteria set by NERC, MPCC, and the New York State Reliability Council. Then we have the economic planning process, right, where we look at what transmission needs occurred due to congestion on the system. And then finally, we have the public policy transmission planning process that is connected with the Public Service Commission and identifying transmission needs driven by public policy requirements. So that's at the regional level. We also have interregional coordination with PJM and ISO New England. But even beyond there, there's also development by the TOs at the local level. And then we also have merchant projects that come in. So when I talk about the two former, those are what we normally put in the realm of regulated transmission. What it means is that they're going to be getting cost recovery in some way through either state or federal rates. Merchant projects, though, are those projects that are just going to be seeking, they're going to still obtain a rate, but it's going to be through entities that want to obtain transmission service directly from them, tenant entities. And so that while the NYISO wraps into its total regional plan, that's a separate bucket. So I think those are the four big ones. And then also the state does transmission planning as well. That gets largely rolled up through the TO's local transmission plans. Correct me if I missed anything, Dana.
That's a great summary.
Great. So with all of these processes that, potential transmission developers could go through, I guess which process yields the biggest turnout for transmission?
I think you have to define that.
Yeah.
Right? Because we have a lot of local transmission being developed by the TOs in conjunction with the state. The state approved, I forget the number, but several $1 million worth of local transmission upgrades that is aimed at, among other things, achieving the CLCPA. But then we also have in the NYISO, we had in the last, I think it was 4 major transmission projects. We actually, 4 that were selected by the NYISO board, and 2 of them are being constructed. I'm getting 3 have been constructed. 1 is currently under development. And those were multi-million-dollar projects of a rather large size. So I don't want to be the judge of that, but that's, I think, unless you have something to add about the volume of transmission. We also have other major projects that are going on from a market-based perspective as well, and through the PSC. There's a Northern New York priority project that's being built, and as well as some other ones. So I don't want to say which one, but what we have seen is probably since 2018, a major uptick in the development of transmission in New York State that hasn't been seen in probably 20, 30 years prior.
I would just add to that too. I think New York's a little bit unique in that all of the projects that Brian talked about at the kind of regional level are going through the public policy planning process, which kind of, again, was part of Order 1000. And I think that's really kind of speaks to the benefits of being in a single state where kind of the state has a clear vision for where it wants to go policy-wise and has been able to work productively with the NYISO to kind of achieve those policies through its planning processes. That's much more difficult when you look at other regions of the country where you have multiple states trying to work together. And so I think as we talk about Order 890 later in the conversation, that's kind of something to keep in mind, is that having kind of that policy focus has already put New York in a pretty good place.
Right. And I know our focus today is on transmission in New York, but Abe, I hope I'm not putting you on the spot, but I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about what it's like in those other regions where there are multiple states in a region, like a PJM or ISO New England.
We're incredibly jealous of the process that New York has. We talk a lot about public policy and transmission for public policy. Well, in PJM, we're trying to harmonize the public policies of states like Ohio, West Virginia, Kentucky, with the public policies of places like Vermont, Illinois, Maryland. And that is an incredible challenge. And one of the things that I think drives a lot of this, a lot of these transmission questions is in PJM, we need a little bit of counseling to bring our states together so that they can sort of share in thinking about how do we design a transmission system that works for the needs of Ohio and works for the needs of Maryland. And how do we think about allocating the costs? I mean, it really is like a kind of like almost like a sibling rivalry kind of situation. New York obviously doesn't have that quite to the same degree, and so it's very nice. And even New England has sort of looked at, across a bunch of very disparate states, they have a little bit more commonality in public policy. So we in New Jersey are really kind of, we in PJM are very much in, note-taking mode where we're trying to build some of these processes that have evolved more naturally in other places. When we think about multi-state transmission planning, the Midwest is the gold standard for doing this. The Midwest Independent System Operator, what is it, about 14 states in the Midwest? I probably should know that number. Yeah. But they have really been working on transmission planning for a decade, and they've been very successful at bringing political leaders in those states together to agree on what their long-term transmission priorities are, and then to implement it through their tariff. So they are done very much what New York did in the sense of building consensus, very much what New England has been able to do, while we in PJM sort of sit back and are trying to build those processes as we speak.
Great. Yeah, and so bringing it back into NYISO and New York's planning processes, I was wondering, Dana, do you mind describing a little bit? We'll peel back a little bit more from the high level we've been at, but how do transmission owners interact with the NYISO and plan transmission in their territories?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I would say that planning in particular for reliability in New York is very much a shared responsibility between the NYISO and the TOs. The NYISO plans for the reliability of the regional system, and we plan for the reliability of our local systems. And I know that's kind of confusing. Where does that division lie? The way that I like to think about it is that NYISO is really planning for the big picture of how do we move power across the state, from Utica to New York City on our big high voltage transmission lines, whereas each of the transmission owners is planning for, all right, we're going to take the power off of that, highway system, and how do we get it to our customers through, all of our side streets and side roads, kind of the local transmission and distribution system. So that's kind of how the division of labor works. NYISO does their reliability studies on a 2-year basis. We work with them on those studies, and we also do our own studies for our local systems, identifying projects that we need to build out over the coming years. Once a need is identified, then we'll work with our stakeholders, with the PSC often to kind of work with those projects through our rate cases, as well as with the NYISO and stakeholders to get feedback on our plans. And then once we confirm that we're building something, the NYISO will then add it to their databases so that they have an accurate representation of our systems that they can use for future planning studies. And so that's kind of how the system has typically and traditionally worked. I would say that traditionally and over time, the focus has really been on planning for reliability. But now we're seeing over the past 5 years more and more focus on planning for clean energy, and kind of how do we do that through both. We talked about regional planning with the public policy process, but even on the local side, we've been working together with the other local TOs to figure out how do we plan for the state's clean energy goals and coordinate that both across all the utilities in the state as well as with the NYISO. And we'll talk about that probably a little bit more later, but I'll just tease the word coordinated grid planning process.
It's actually a great segue. So I know we had mentioned the NYISO's public policy process quite a bit, and I was wondering, Brian, if you could dive in a little bit, what are these state policies that are driving transmission development then?
So you're going to test me. Dana actually might.
And Dana, anyone, yeah.
I mean, the big one right now that's driving it is the CLCPA, which is the Climate and Leadership Protection Act. I think I got that right. Which has a bunch of clean energy goals set or mandates that terms use both in it, but to achieve offshore wind, to achieve land-based wind and solar, as well as storage goals, and to ultimately get to a emissions-free grid by 2040. The interim goal that's being worked to right now is 70% renewables by 2030. So if instead of going through all of them, because then you have a bunch of other lists between the DC peaker regulations, NYPA small gas, legislation that passed to shut about, I think it's approximately 400 to 500 megawatts of small generation in New York to have a plan to deactivate it. And then you get to, even the clean energy standard is still out there. And then the one legislation that I always forget, and Danny, you probably know, the one that has the worst acronym.
REGPA.
Thank you. But New York has been, I think, and this is Brian's personal opinion, but at the forefront of coming up with clean energy goals to move us forward. So that's what we're largely working with right now in the state. And there's others. And if there's anyone you want to add, Dana, feel free. But I think that's a general list of the overall goals that New York is trying to achieve.
I would just add, maybe to make that like a little more tangible, like the way that I like to think about the impacts of these goals on kind of what we need to do for planning the transmission system is that these goals are pushing us to change both the way that we supply energy, so how we generate it, as well as, the demand for the electricity. So on the supply side, we have, a system that was built out on a bunch of traditional generation, nuclear and fossil. And over time, that's going to need to transform into a renewable resource mix. And we need to build out transmission to connect those renewables to that highway system I talked about earlier to move it across the state. And then on the demand side, these goals are also pushing us to decarbonize some of our other end uses, like, how we drive our cars, how we heat our homes, and all of that is going to increase electric demand. And so we need to think about how do we deliver that renewable power to that increasing levels of electric demand and kind of build out the system. And so I think just from more of like a kind of physical level, that's kind of how the goals are impacting transmission planning in the state.
Definitely. And bringing it back out to the rest of the US, how, and hopefully Abe or Matt, you could chime in on this one, how are state level policies coordinated within these FERC jurisdictional transmission planning processes?
I think the way that MISO does it is that they use incorporate all these state policies and then figure out how they think that will affect what the generation will be in the future and model towards that. In terms of PJM, Abe is kind of the god of this, but I mean, PJM, they're still trying to make the states pay for things kind of separately on the side. Oh, New Jersey, you want to achieve your clean wind goal, write us a check for transmission. We're not going to put that in our normal process. Abe, what can you add?
If I'm going to be the god of something, I think I'll be something more fun than this. But no, I mean, I think part of the answer is very badly. And we really do have this problem that all the research shows the bigger the transmission system, the cheaper the rates for consumers and the better the reliability and the better the outcomes. And yet within this framework, we have each state doing things. I mean, all the things that you all talked about in New York exist in every one of the 14 jurisdictions in PJM. So we're taking that apparatus and then imposing this larger apparatus over them. And, even if you start thinking about how does PJM do this and how do they coordinate within themselves, we haven't even talked about the next stage of all this, which is if we think that economies of scale are good, then reaching out and touching your neighbors across regional boundaries is also really important. And so, it's been very interesting to think about 1920 and coordinated state action. And I do sort of talk about those as two separate things. How do we get states to work together within the 1920 process, but then how do we even get states to reach out and touch their interregional neighbors and drive some of those even larger transmission facilities across borders? You know, for anybody who's not following it, I would say we have like in FERC world, like it really will be like an early Christmas present when NERC comes out with its interregional transmission capability study, right, which is currently scheduled for December. And we're super excited because that may actually list projects that would benefit the grid without respect to some of these more parochial, you know, frankly, artificial boundaries between regions. And so a lot of what I work on is actually trying to get folks to look at the grid as this one big machine that we always sort of talk about it at, and actually treat it like that for planning and identify the upgrades, you know, that will reduce cost to customers and improve reliability without getting too hung up on who's gonna pay. But of course, it always comes back to the money. So the who pays is a huge issue.
Definitely. And great setup for our next topic, which is FERC Order 1920. So just to start at the beginning, and anyone can take this question, but what is Order 1920? And you know, we sort of talked about how it came to be, but give us some of the good details of it.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about Order 1920. So what you might have heard about 1920 is that it's being framed by a lot of its opponents as like, this is some way to socialize the costs of the transmission that's needed to support blue state clean energy policies. But there's really like a lot more going on in Order 1920. It basically is FERC saying, well, FERC was like, hey, not that much good has happened since Order 1000. A lot of regional transmission line spending has gone down in the regions since we put out Order 1000. No non-RTO region like the South or the West has ever built a transmission line through the Order 1000 process. And so they're like, something's not working here. We don't think you're planning right. And so we think some of the ways that you've been planning wrong are you're not looking far enough into the future. You're not considering enough benefits. And so let's start there. So a lot of the processes that these RTOs or non-RTO Order 1000 planning regions have been using look only 10 years out into the future or 15 for PJM. FERC said you have to look 20 years into the future because a lot of these projects will take like 10 years to even get built. So if you're like planning 10 years into the future, like you can't even make the math work. And these projects are very long lived. A lot of these transmission lines will last like 40 years or so. So we have to think about their benefits like much farther into the future than just over the next 10 years. And we don't think you're looking at the right benefits when you're choosing what transmission lines to build. So here's like a list of mandatory benefits that you have to consider. And they're nothing crazy. They're like reduced fuel costs, reduced blackouts, and none of the benefits that are being ordered to require that are like or anything related to public policy or achieving states' public policies. They're all economic and reliability based. And then FERC says, when you're doing your planning, because we're asking you to plan so far out, we're going to ask you to use a method called scenario planning, which says we don't really know what the future is going to look like. So let's come up with at least 3 possible futures. And that the 3 futures will be, you'll vary lots of your variables across them for your modeling. Like maybe in one of the futures, the cost of CCS is very low. And then another one, it's whatever you expect it actually will be. And then another one, it'll be higher than you expect it to be. And then when you look at your transmission needs, and you do that for lots of different variables, not just CCS, but also the cost of wind, the cost of solar. You're going to change all these variables up, and then we're going to see like what transmission lines you need in each scenario. And then you're going to compare that across the scenarios. And maybe some of your scenarios, you'll see lines that appear in that scenario, but not in other scenarios. And in some scenarios, you'll see all like the same line reappearing. And that might be a good sign that that's actually a line you're really going to need in the future. So they basically say, do the scenario-based planning. And as you're coming up with your scenarios, to make sure your scenarios are accurate, here's 7 things that need to be accounted for in your scenarios. And the first 2 is where like a lot of the controversy appears, which is FERC says, we need you to plan for state policies as if they will be achieved, period. So like if you're the NYISO planning in New York, you need to plan around all of New York's public policies being achieved. And FERC said that because they said all these public policies are important drivers of transmission, and these are what's actually affecting what transmission will be needed when and where, and this is what's affecting changes in demand, this is what's affecting changes in supply. So, and states are powerful and they will achieve their goals, so plan for that. And I was actually rereading this part of the order yesterday, and they cited one contrary comment from NYISO, which I thought was interesting. That NYISO was the one saying, maybe state policies don't always get achieved. But so there's 6 more factors, including like retirements, future costs of resources, for states that have integrated resource plans, like what resources the utility board says will get built and when. So basically, FERC is saying, let's have more accurate planning that goes farther into the future. And to do kind of a stupid analogy for a second, to grocery shopping, basically, we think that you've been doing too much takeout, too much running to the bodega and buying things last minute. We want you to start meal prepping, going to get a Costco membership, that we think that if you do these processes, you're going to start building the big transmission lines that will save you money through economies of scale. So that's sort of like the first half of the order. And there's a lot of, I'll just briefly say, there's also provisions about cost allocation, that once these lines get selected to be built, who's going to pay for them. The FERC orders the transmission planners to also come up with processes for selecting or for evaluating these lines that get pitched in these processes and deciding whether or not they should get built or not get built. And sort of one asterisk at the end of all of this is they basically say, even though we've told you to do all this, we can't actually, this order is not actually telling you like that you need to build any lines. You could like get through your whole process and decide like, this line is amazing from a cost benefit perspective. We choose not to build it. So that's sort of like, I think sort of for like a legal protection angle, but that's a lot of FERC's 1920. People can add in more details.
Well, I'll just say, I mean, round of applause. That was actually
that's
a
like
very impressive to take in all the various different.
I was gonna say, how many pages again? 1,300? Yeah, so
that's
those are great.
Concurrence and
Right.
So the one thing I just want to notice is even more complicated than just the state, because all of the laws that we're talking about for mandatory factors you have to consider in developing your scenarios, it's federal, federally recognized tribal organizations. I'm not getting that term exactly right. State and local. And so when you put all those, like, I mean, yes, New York sits here pretty well. We're a single state ISO, right? So our state has quite a bit of power influence over dictating, not only the resources that get put on the system, but also the public policy requirements. But when you get to, as Abe was mentioned earlier, when you get to the multi-state ISOs, you have the multi-states, so no state is ultimately powerful. And I think it's hard for a regional transmission organization or ISO to be the one necessarily to dictate that, because you have the individual states, but then you also have federal policy. And I thought that it's an interesting read in Order 1920, but sometimes I'm guilty of this when I went through law school, but I skipped a concurrence, skipped a dissent, right? Because there's just more reading. I don't want to do it. But in this one, it's pretty interesting to read Commissioner Christie's dissent, because he does point out a lot of these issues. But yeah, so that was a great recitation. It's just really complicated even beyond that. And it's a very robust order that has plenty of other tentacles too.
Right. And, I know this has already been answered slightly, and I think the audience is going to know the answer to this question, but, who's impacted by this order, and what approach does an ISO or a local transmission owner take to comply with an order like this of this magnitude?
I think the whole country is impacted by this order. I think at the forefront right now it is the transmission providers, which can include an ISO RTO, and the transmission owners who are on the forefront of coming up with a compliance plan for it. And within that, the compliance plan is FERC does acknowledge that there are regional variations, and some current planning processes may have some of these elements in 1920. So FERC is not saying absolutely you have to go exactly with what this specific code says. It gives some ability to seek variations through consistent with or superior to, but yeah, you're going to have to go through those tasks. I think the NYISO Order 1000 compliance filing, I think there was 8 filings ultimately before FERC accepted it. So I think at the forefront is, I don't have an exact way, but at least the ISO can say this is how we're going to go through compliance. We work with stakeholders. We work with very close with TOs, with the state entities, including the New York State Public Service Commission. So it is a rather large task. But let me let Dana weigh in.
Yeah.
I'm going at the very uber high level here.
I would kind of say more from kind of like a practical level, like when for a TO situated in an ISO like we are, the bulk of the compliance filing is obviously going to be the NYISOs to kind of put in and file with FERC. But there are some parts of the order that do impact the local TOs and that will need to coordinate with the NYISO on. One of the areas is transparency of planning. There's some very specific requirements in there about how we do our local planning and how we get input from stakeholders into that planning before we kind of decide what project we want to pursue. And that's because there have been some concerns, primarily, I'm sorry, Abe from the PJM region, about there not being adequate opportunities for that input. And so that's an area where we as the local TO will need to work with the NYISO on their compliance plan. Similarly, there's some provisions in there also related to economies of scale. So to the extent that we're planning to do things on our local systems, replacing equipment that's at its end of its life, they want us to coordinate with the ISO RTO to identify if there's opportunities to right size it, quote unquote, to kind of provide benefits to the overall system. So if we have a 230 kV line and we want to replace it because it's at the end of its life, NYISO could evaluate, hey, because of all these renewables coming online or this load growth in this area, maybe it makes sense to build it at the 345 kV level instead because you're replacing it anyway. And that's another thing that we need to look at under Order 1920 and where the TOs will need to coordinate with the NYISO. And then last, I would just say, so those are kind of the more operational based impacts of the order on us. But in addition to that, we also speak on behalf of our customers, and our customers are going to be responsible for paying for all of these lines, all of these transmission that comes out of this process. And so we very much have an interest in how the cost allocation, well, first of all, how we decide what projects should move forward in the first place, kind of how we weigh all the 7 factors that come out that we're required to look at. Looking at all of those, how do we decide which projects should actually move forward? And then once we decide that, how does that get paid for, and how does it get paid for in an equitable manner? I think those are kind of, from the TO perspective, those are all things that we're going to be looking for as kind of NYISO develops its compliance plan. So no pressure.
Because it even goes deeper, because you have the right of first refusal for the right sizing. So like there's just all these elements that flow through, and I mean, we could probably be here for, I don't know, 2 days talking about all the nuances, if not longer. So if everyone feels like it is a high level, please understand that it needs to be in order to fit it in. But Abe, I think you might have, I don't know if you had something to add.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think the other thing to recognize about 1920 is it fundamentally says you can't have a situation where one state simply says no to multi-state transmission planning. Because before 1920, and I think this is like the burden shifting. I know it's not a room full of lawyers. I shouldn't use legal terms like that. But it really does sort of shift from being a nope, I'm not interested. I, as a state, don't share your public policy priorities. I have no interest in facilitating your transmission goals. I'm just not going to dialogue with you. And now we're almost in a forced conversation between the various states as we think about both putting together the cost allocation piece, but also this measurement of benefits. And if you sort of go way back really to the 1930s under the Federal Power Act, there's always been this concept that costs should follow benefits. And I think under Order 1000, FERC sort of moved away from that because you had to have a situation where under Order 1000, if multiple states were going to fund a transmission project, they effectively had to agree to share the costs. And that is really hard to get agreement. Now, under 1920, they've sort of gone back to beneficiary pays and says, hey, if there are transmission projects that have benefits across multiple states, those costs should be allocated in proportion to the benefits. So in some ways, it's back to the future, in going back to sort of historic precedent. But I think that's a really, really critical piece of the puzzle. And as we think about sort of the politics of all this, because I agree with Matt, it's the politics can be rather toxic. And I also agree, don't skip Commissioner Christie's dissent in this particular case. In fact, I'd go there first, just because it is sort of it is a starkly different vision of the future. The idea that we are going to have the states required to sit down and hammer out some of these decisions, and that we're then going to memorialize them up front in the tariffs going forward, is really a sea change. It's as important as all the other 7 factors of benefits, 7 factors of causes for new transmission needs, all that stuff. But ultimately, it comes down to the idea that we now have to sit in that room and come up with something that we can put down on paper that will govern cost allocation going forward.
Mm-hmm. Right. And as we're talking about this, we're talking about Order 1920 as it stands now, but as we know, there are a lot of pending legal challenges to it. So Matt, if you wouldn't mind speaking to some of those, what are some of those challenges and what do you think is the legal durability of this order? Getting the big questions.
Yeah. So in FERC world, if you're going to sue on an order, you have to have filed a rehearing request, and the law says also that you're only allowed to litigate on the issues from your own rehearing request. So before this, I looked at the rehearing requests of the people who are suing, or the ones that were online as of that date. And the narrative is basically the sort of the frontline argument seems to be that you are intruding on state authority, FERC, by basically deciding the future generation mix of the United States, and you have become the integrated resources planner for the whole country, and you are facilitating these blue state policies at the expense of our red state ratepayers. And that violates the Federal Power Act, because the Federal Power Act says that FERC only has the authority over things that the states don't regulate, and the states regulate the generation mix, and FERC is just supposed to regulate transmission, and other sort of interstate stuff. And then sort of sometimes that gets mixed up with major questions doctrine arguments, including from the famous Christie dissent from the order itself. He said, this is the biggest violation of the major questions doctrine ever. And a lot of these issues were litigated already in the Order 1000 litigation. The DC Circuit kind of rejected them pretty quickly. This is the South Carolina Public Service Commission v. FERC case. And in that case, they dealt with pretty similar arguments with respect to sort of the public policy stuff that was in Order 1000. And the DC Circuit only took a couple of paragraphs to basically say, you were totally misrepresenting this. FERC is not telling the states what generation to build. FERC is saying that state policies are an input that should be used to figure out what transmission lines should get built, where, and when. And the state policies are an input. FERC is not outputting state policies. That's kind of a silly misrepresentation. If you add sort of the major questions layer to it, I think a lot of that, so the major questions doctrine is a case, or is a legal doctrine that was formalized in the West Virginia, the EPA case from a couple of years back, and it often gets misrepresented as this idea that whenever an agency does something that's politically or economically a big deal, that there needs to be like very, very, very clear language in the statute that that's what the agency is empowered to do. But the test is actually a lot more complicated than that. And the test is basically like, as the Supreme Court describes it, when an agency does something that is a big deal politically, economically, and is unlike anything the agency has ever tried to do before, and radically transforms the relationship between that agency as a regulator and the industry that it regulates, then we have something called a major question. And you apply all the normal tools of statutory interpretation to figure out whether that's really the best reading of the statute, but you approach it with skepticism. And it's not actually a clear statement rule in the way that a lot of legal doctrines are a clear statement rule. And sort of when you apply that framing to what the doctrine actually is, and you think about all the discussion we've had about Order 888, 890, Order 1000, and you could even go back further. If you go back into the 70s, FERC was approving power pool agreements with planning provisions. In 1999, FERC issued Order 2000, which was the basis for the RTO system that had which said RTOs need to plan for their regions. FERC has been doing planning and cost allocation for like 50 years. And so this is different from what happened in West Virginia, where EPA put out a plan that was very unusual as compared to how it had previously regulated pollution from sources, and was kind of a departure from anything the agency had ever done before. So that's kind of a long way of saying that I think that the major questions doctrine stuff that Commissioner Christie has flagged is very, very wrong. And then if you get past that, then there's sort of the next line arguments against Order 1920, which are sort of you never had the evidence that you needed to find under Section 206 of the Federal Power Act to find that planning has been happening in an unjust, unreasonable, discriminatory, or unduly preferential way. And some of the case law on that is actually pretty good for FERC. Usually the case law says FERC can make large rules for the whole country as long as the practices that FERC is identifying are not actually isolated to small pockets of the country. Mm-hmm. It's not the reverse burden where FERC has to where if it's working anywhere, then they can't regulate it anywhere. So that in order for them to win on that basis, there would the challengers to win on that basis, there would need to be a big change in the law. Mm-hmm. So probably where the order is most vulnerable, if it's vulnerable, is under some kind of normal arbitrary and capricious review. There's a million sorts of judgments that FERC made, state policies will be achieved, mm-hmm. and therefore should be planned for, mm-hmm. That a hostile Supreme Court could picket them for, and there could be some sort of redux of last term's Ohio v. EPA decision, which was about the good neighbor provision, an air pollution law scheme about under the Clean Air Act, what do you do when you're out of compliance with your Clean Air Act requirements because somebody a state upstream of you is polluting into your borders? And the Supreme Court kind of nitpicked the EPA to death. And it was a 5-4 decision where not even Justice Barrett was with the main conservatives, which sort of, I think, is an indication of sort of maybe the flimsiness of the nitpicking. And so the Supreme Court, whenever they want to, can nitpick any agency action to that. But I think otherwise, the 1920 is on good legal ground.
And I'll just pick up on that real quick, because I mean, I had a professor in law school who was always my civil procedure professor. Read the statute. And if you read the statute, transmission, authority over transmission is right there in the statute. So it's a little bit hard for me to think about coming in and saying that somehow this is way outside the scope of FERC's jurisdiction. But the other point I want to make is our thesis, and by our, I sort of think people who spend their lives thinking about transmission cost allocation and expanding the transmission grid, is that if we study new transmission facilities, we will see better outcomes for consumers. And one of the things that I love about 1920 is it is basically the world's biggest study provision. It's really important what Matt said earlier, I think it was you, who said, at the end of 1920, the ISOs don't actually have to select a project for construction. It really is a transparency statute. And so my thesis, and we'll know in 3 or 4 years when we sort of go through the first round of this, is that states and consumers are going to see such enormous benefits in terms of resource adequacy benefits, in terms of reliability, in terms of lower costs, that 1920, even if it is somehow struck down, I'm thinking like Darth Vader and Obi-Wan Kenobi in the first Star Wars movie, you'll come back more powerful than you ever could have been because consumers are going to see the savings and see the benefits, and they're going to insist on implementing some of these transmission facilities. So ultimately, I feel like, the truth will win out. And as long as we get through as much of the study process as we can, we start seeing results before potentially it goes to the Supreme Court, and then it gets remanded back to FERC, which I honestly, frankly, think probably will happen. But we will be through those rounds of studies, and we will have a real transparency into the benefits. And I think at that point, consumers are just going to demand transmission expansion because it's just such a freaking good deal.
That's great. No, and no, now that we've gotten through, some of the intricacies of Order 1920, and this one's coming back to you too, as you were speaking about benefits, although I'm not sure all would see it as benefits, but how can RTOs and ISOs use Order 1920 to better facilitate interregional planning?
Oh, yeah. So everything we've been talking about today is intra-regional. And yet, so there's this enormous value that we have left on the table as a society because we don't have a venue, we don't have a mechanism, we don't have a FERC mandate or a congressional mandate to look across regional boundaries. And when you sort of read the research on this, and the Department of Energy has done innumerable studies on this, they show that there are real benefits to consumers. Again, I'm sort of a broken record. We've talked about cost allocation. I'm always talking about benefits allocation. Because at the end of the day, we are identifying benefits associated with new transmission, and then we're carving up who's going to pay for that. So 1920, I want to be really clear, is largely about this intra-regional piece of the puzzle. Order 1000 does have a lot more inter-regional, cross-regional border rules. But at the end of the day, there's no action forcing mechanism. And it's really important to recognize that Order 1000 is about coordination between ISOs and not planning across ISO boundaries. So a lot of my work personally is looking at how states can solve this issue, this lack of FERC mandate, this lack of congressional mandate to do planning across regional boundaries. So if the states come and say, hey, we think this is something we would like to see because we see enormous benefits, and it's particularly true in offshore wind, but other places as well, that the states can then say to the ISOs, we want to inject our interregional planning priorities into the Order 1920, into the Order 1000 transmission planning processes, and start sort of almost bootstrapping some interregional transmission goals into the existing ISO systems, even if we don't get additional FERC authority or congressional authority. Now, I will add, there's a lot of rumors going around that FERC is going to issue an interregional version of 1920, but we haven't seen it yet. And certainly we see this in a bunch of congressional statutes as well, including the Manchin-Barrasso bill. But my theory is always hope for the best, plan for the worst. So I'd be very curious to hear what you all think about how do we do interregional planning without that kind of FERC mandate.
Well, I'll just say, currently we do coordination, right? As you know. And I do think the coordination does work among the ISOs and to really largely ensure each region understands what the other region's doing. And I think we still always have to come back to reliability, because reliability is going to be the forefront on the transmission system. It's one of the foundations of the Federal Power Act, the ISOs, RTOs, and transmission providers. So that's really always been largely the focus. But I've been doing this for about 9 years now. And the one thing I can say is transmission planning and resource planning is nothing but daily, monthly, and yearly change. So as you start widening the planning scope, right, that introduces much more change. So I personally am still struggling with this. How do you do the larger scope with all these changes that are happening and all these different assumptions and everything to that effect, and still come up with a 20-year plan that looks at almost 40 years of benefits? So I don't have a specific opinion on that, but I put that out to the crowd and everyone. Think about the monumental task, because you finish, even if you finish in your connection study, right, the next day something may have changed on the system. So it's not this, you don't ever get a static, perfect picture of the system ever in this process. So that's just my kind of thinking of it. It's really the problem solution that has to come up with is how can you do this when you look at, because local is, you know, this big a circle, regional is this big a circle, and then interregional is just,
No, right, yeah.
No, but I think that's just a question that everyone just has to think from a practical standpoint, in the trenches standpoint.
Definitely. And, you know, I do want to be mindful of time, so I want to open it up to the audience if anyone has any questions.
I regret to remind everybody that we're in an election year.
Yeah.
Really?
The administration change affect the implementation of Order 1920 or future FERC action?
Well, badly. But okay, so we just appointed 3 new FERC commissioners. So I might need help with this. The Democrats have the majority. If Phillips doesn't resign, sometimes the chairman resigns on the change of administration. But if Phillips doesn't resign, the Democrats have a majority for like 4 more years or something. I might have that wrong.
It's a while.
Oh, a little bit. And so that they would have control for like the compliance process. And so like they would be the ones in charge, I guess, while the RTOs are sending their compliance filings and doing that, and also for the rehearing process. But that's happening now. But then I guess like eventually FERC could just do like an about face and follow the APA and write a new reg. Yeah.
I'll give you a slightly more upbeat outlook. And I'm mostly in denial that this is an election year. But, you know, there is certain social license that will happen if there is a change in administration to someone who is, you know, potentially less favorable to clean energy outcomes. It will empower state regulators to take actions that they probably politically could not do otherwise. You know, and I do think that if you sort of look over the last few years, a lot of really aggressive state policies were actually passed during the first Trump administration. And you saw a lot of states coming together, and I happened to be in New Jersey for the time, so I sort of saw it, you know, firsthand. There was just this sense that these hot button climate change issues we had to fix them. We couldn't rely on the white knight riding in from Capitol Hill. I mean, don't ever do that. But, you know, you couldn't rely on the IRA or the Biden administration to fix things. It was really much more self-help. And so if we did have that, you know, happen, I think you could see a real supercharging of state policies and in some ways a more aggressive deployment of clean energy in the states for whom they think this is important. But I also, you know, I have to say I was very pleased when the Senate approved a Democratic majority for basically the whole pendency of the 1920 compliance process. So that's really good news for those of us who believe in sort of like a regulatory stability.
I'll just add that's because FERC's an independent agency, and so like it's not like the Department of Defense or something like that where like everybody changes out at the change of the term. Like they have these terms that overlap or don't overlap with the president.
Go ahead. Oh, in the back. Yeah.
Same question. So I think thanks, Brock. Same question. It's kind of a roll on to the scenario planning, but what about the Chevron case, the overturn of Chevron? And FERC being an agency that might not require that deference anymore. How does that roll into the state planning processes required by 1920? Have you heard any backlash or anything from your own circles on how that will be contested, or are states really just emboldening the details and taking it a lot more seriously if they want to?
I'll give you my very quick, and it comes back to my answer I gave previously about how much statutory authority FERC has and how clear FERC's statutory authority is. Chevron kicks in when there's ambiguity in the statute. I'm not sure there's a heck of a lot of ambiguity in a lot of the things that FERC does. Now that presupposes, that we're not putting your finger on the outcome of legal proceedings. I mean, that would never happen, right? So I do sort of worry about the Supreme Court when things get there. But from my point of view, actually, Chevron is much more important for agencies that have more specific statutory authority, or statutory authority that doesn't really the Venn diagram of sort of what they've done historically, kind of exactly what Matt was saying, doesn't map to what they're trying to do today. For FERC, I mean, FERC's been doing basically the same thing for 100 years. So I think it's hard to say that they, that Chevron is going to kick in a really aggressive way for a lot of FERC decisions. But
We haven't just deferred on the Supreme Court, but yeah.
Supreme Court, I think it's interesting to see their sort of departure from stare decisis, and who knows, but.
I'll add that. So in the Loper-Bright decision that overturned Chevron, I mean, there was a whole passage about how like an ambiguity in like a law is different from like a capacious grant of authority that like tells the agency to like use your best judgment and figure stuff out. And I agree with Abe that this is kind of one of those statutes. But I will say that in the South Carolina decision that upheld, the DC Circuit decision that upheld Order 1000, the DC Circuit did rely on Chevron in like 3 places that had to do with like what a practice affecting transmission rates would be. And like some of the arguments were like a little like niche and specific, but like for example, like the ROFR prohibition, right of first refusal prohibition, was like one of the applications of Chevron there. I think like the court probably didn't need to do Chevron. I'm not sure like why they thought the statute was like ambiguous enough to rely on Chevron. But I feel like the 2016 Supreme Court demand response case adds like additional light on like what is a practice affecting rates, and so like maybe add some additional clarity. But ultimately, I kind of agree with Abe that I don't think this is like the poster child for like where the death of Chevron will matter.
Yeah, so basically what I'm hearing here is that to the extent that both New York and New York State have significant offshore power wind goals, that 1920 will not have much impact on any efforts they may be making to coordinate those offshore wind goals. Just would like you to confirm that, and also hear you speak about the potential future of coordination between New York and New Jersey in that respect.
I will, and I could say this as somebody who doesn't follow the New York day-to-day process quite as closely, but from what I can tell, y'all got it already. I mean, the PPTN, I have no idea what that acronym stands for.
Yeah. You got it. Yeah.
Public policy transmission need.
Thank you. The identification and coordination of offshore wind transmission in New York is really a model that a lot of us look towards. So in that sense, I feel like we have it in New York. The interesting question is, how do we think about this coordination across the regional borders? And again, I don't think 1920 really talks about this a lot, but it is important in the sense that it gives states the venue to come together within the region and adopt standards. And I think if we do it right, the 1920 rules and scenarios and technology choices that we implement in New York can match those that we're doing in PJM, can match those that we're doing in New England. So we end up at the end of the day with consistency as much as we possibly can across the 3 regions, even if they're not explicitly coordinating. And a lot of what I do talking to states is thinking about how do we avoid sort of like the trolley car problem from the early 20th century, where every city had its own incompatible trolley car gauge, right? We want to make sure that if New York is doing 12 gauge offshore wind, that New Jersey's doing that New England's doing that, and that we really think about the compatibility and some of the supply chain issues. The question of actually how do we coordinate across New York and New Jersey, or really between New York and New England, is a good one. We spend a lot of time looking at what are the projects that we could do. I mean, it's hard not to notice that there's an offshore wind lease area right next to another offshore lease area. One of them's going to New England, one of them's going to New York. Wouldn't it be nice to build that like little line that connects the two? And the same thing on the New Jersey side. I think what the Department of Energy has done with the IRA and Build Back Better funds is, you asked about elections earlier. I think the future of the Grid Deployment Office and the future of those funding streams that promote interregional transmission coordination is as big an issue in terms of, what could happen in a potential second Trump administration as any of the other things we're talking about. And so if that goes away, it will take away some of the financial incentive that regions have to plan with each other. And that would actually be really sad. But other than that, I think, New York's policies are actually pretty good.
I'm going to preface this by saying I don't mean to be judgmental because I'm Canadian. So I'm looking at this as an observer and a fascination with grid issues and New York specifically. And I came at it originally. My eureka moment was the NREL SEAM study. So this is sort of like, oh, that makes sense. It all trickles down that if we just coordinate things bigger, it can make more sense across everybody. And what's big should work smaller down too. You brought up the issue about FERC and assume that the policies that are very aggressive in New York, that are very forward in New York, are achieved is one scenario. But how much do you actually, in your planning or in the back of your mind or in everything that you do? Because I sat in a room yesterday with people from the DOE, an ISERTA guy, an academic, and a conspiracy theorist, but he's really just an independent consultant. That based on their best modeling, not the NYISO person, that you don't have the resource adequacy, the resource availability that you probably will need by 2040, 2050. And there will be tons of horrible, curtailments and tons of gas that you're not allowed to build anymore needed. How much in the back of your mind when you're actually, realistically trying to do planning in this energy transition, do you actually leave that back there to say, hey, maybe we won't reach these ideal modeling goals that we hope to as a state? Or do you have to stick to the law? You have to stick to what the...
Well, I think one of the elements that the NYISO or New York State has is the NYISO uses a system and resource outlook, which looks at 20 years and kind of models constraints and other needs over the course of 20 years. And it does it through using production costs and capacity modeling to determine what would be a potential outlook or a future resource mix. And then also on the state level, in conjunction with the TOs, is the state does something similar through the coordinated grid planning process, where you're using what is the law, what is the ultimate goal, and then doing the resource mixes, and you're doing various scenarios and sensitivities to really understand the likelihood of the consequences if you use this resource or that resource, or rely primarily on this, or you get into what we affectionately call in New York as the dispatchable emission-free resource, which is a resource that would have very similar attributes to what we have as conventional generations. It's just hasn't been developed yet, or on a utility scale that is easily deployable. So I think you are looking at this in all the planning. Is there and this goes back to my previous point, is there's no crystal ball here. So I think already you have the inroads in New York that people are already looking at this stuff on both the regional and the local level and trying to plan to it. But it is something where if there is issues with resources in the future, you do have issues with not only intra planning, but inter-regional planning gets that much more complicated. I don't think.
I'll just also go ahead.
I would just add to that too, kind of thinking about it from like a local level. One of the things that we really focus on too is trying to identify multi-value projects. So projects that aren't just serving one driver, just integrate clean energy, but also help us think about how we're going to meet future load growth, future demand in our system. We have one example of that right now. We're building a substation out in Brooklyn that will help us connect to meet growing load in Brooklyn due to electrification, but also provides points for offshore wind to connect to. And so by identifying projects that hit multiple buckets, that also helps mitigate that risk because you're kind of providing multiple benefits and value streams to the investments that you're making.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I think interregional transmission planning is a great insurance policy about being wrong about our future projections, because it really helps if you can reach out and touch your neighboring region if your offshore wind doesn't happen to show up on a particular day. So again, totally appreciate the difficulties and the challenges. And, maybe we only get to 95% decarbonization. Oh, well. But if you are planning for that robust system of the future and want to allow for a lot of different contingencies, a lot of different technology types, you kind of get to the same place. So the critical path for all of these goals is the same direction, regardless of whether you're sort of a skeptic about whether, the states meet their priorities or not.
Thank you.
I apologize taking this in a somewhat different direction. Abe, you had said that you had confidence that consumers would see the benefit. Leaving aside how long it's going to take before they see that benefit, just a little history. In New York, both NYSERDA and DPS used to be sleepy places that almost nobody who was not an attorney or an engineer or a nerd of some sort were part of. And then with Green Jobs, Green New York, and later with reforming the energy vision, all of a sudden, who are all these people that are showing up and advocating for this, that, and the other thing that we don't know about? New York's an oddball. That's not the case in most of the country. There are a few others. What does that actually look like? How can we, I don't know if people have heard about Power Lines. There's this new nonprofit that this guy from Lawrence Berkeley is starting up to try and shine light on PUCs across the country. ISOs, you guys are still kind of, off there. So I guess where does that come from? How do we actually have consumers responding in something like real time to say, oh, you know what? It actually makes sense that we got lines between PJM and New York, and I don't care about this ideological nonsense.
No, that's a great question. And I'll sort of take that in two directions. One is, at the end of the day, the vast majority of consumers care about their bills. And so we need to be able to talk about how all of these public policy choices take us into bill land. And you got to translate that. So I think the evidence suggests that the bills will be lower if we do these kinds of long-term transmission planning projects. I mean, that is what all the evidence suggests. But I will also say, and one of the reasons, I chose to go to academia rather than going back to the private sector was we have a human supply chain constraint. And when we think about how do we get the PUCs staffs up to meet the challenges of the next 100 years instead of the past 100 years, that is really significant. The same thing, frankly, for the ISOs. The amount of work that we are asking the ISOs to do has at least doubled in the past 3 years, and I'm guessing your staffs have not doubled. And so, how do we do that kind of education? How do we make it sexy to go work for states regulators or go to work for an ISO? How do we get the engineering graduates that we need to go and teach them how to do power flow models? I mean, honestly, it's really one of the reasons I went to academia, because I think we need that. So I think it is education. Honestly, it's kind of a boring answer. But getting people to, study, analyze, talk about, run campaigns that, show consumers at the end of the day, you will be better off. Now, of course, the problem is a lot of the benefits for these big, expensive interregional transmission lines appear to future consumers. So consumers today are going to pay more, but you get benefits and very large benefits in the future. How we think about that, how we talk about that generational equity thing is definitely one of the more complicated pieces of all this. So I'm not at all insensitive to that concern. But at the end of the day, where they've done this, and I just point to MISO as like the prototypical example, they have some obscenely large benefit number. It's like $40 billion for a $16 billion investment. And that kind of payback, that kind of ROI is hard to ignore. And so how do we actually get consumers to go there? It's difficult, but I think the math is pretty compelling at the end of the day, and that's why we have technocrats working at all these different levels who can make those decisions.
And it's time to cut it off, but I just want to say thank you to the panelists. This was really, really great, and thank you to everyone here for your questions.